In my case, people really didn't see me play on national TV. I was from a mid-major school. And then you come in and with all the hype and the play that you did, and we were undefeated.
I think Bird and Magic saved the league, and I think the league took off when the Detroit Pistons showed up on the scene. How the United States was for black men in the 70s.
But I love playing with those guys because you know they're going to be very competitive, and they're one of the greatest players in the league, and sometimes it's great to play against players like that.
The 1980s NBA was saved by rivalry. Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird became the story that rescued a struggling league from tape-delayed finals and declining interest. But beneath the celebrated competition lay something far more complex, a web of racial tension, competitive fury, and psychological warfare that shaped how black NBA legends viewed their white rival. When Larry Bird entered the NBA in 1979, the league was in crisis. Finals games aired on tape delay. The NBA was perceived as too black for mainstream white America. Drug scandals threatened credibility. Into this environment came Bird, a white forward from French Lick, Indiana, joining the Boston Celtics. His arrival became a cultural event. Boston carried heavy racial baggage from the 1970s busing crisis. The Celtics, despite Bill Russell's legacy, were often perceived as representing white establishment basketball. For black superstars already dominating the league, Bird's media treatment created immediate friction. The deepest source of resentment came from language. Sports media in the 1980s consistently described Bird's success using terms like intelligent, high basketball IQ, cerebral, and hardworking. His physical limitations were framed as obstacles overcome by superior mental processing. Meanwhile, Magic Johnson, a 6'9" point guard with revolutionary court vision, was called gifted and praised for natural ability. Michael Jordan's dominance was attributed to God-given talent. This distinction cut deep. It suggested that black excellence was accidental, genetic, instinctive, while white excellence required intellect and work ethic. For players who studied film for hours, who practiced relentlessly, who understood complex defensive schemes, this narrative felt like theft of their intellectual labor. Magic Johnson, despite his genius-level understanding of basketball, was reduced to physical gifts. The implications stung. Black players were bodies, white players were minds. Magic Johnson admitted he hated Larry and every Celtic. This wasn't casual dislike, it was consuming. Bird kept Johnson awake at night in ways no other opponent could. The Lakers were showtime, flashy, predominantly black, Hollywood-based. The Celtics represented discipline, tradition, blue-collar basketball. Every Lakers-Celtics finals became a referendum on basketball styles, and beneath the surface, on race. The 1984 finals proved particularly painful. The Lakers lost, and media labeled Magic Tragic Johnson. Before games, Bird would approach Magic with pronouncements like, "Sit back, I'm going to put on a show tonight." The arrogance was infuriating, yet this hatred contained strange intimacy. Johnson later realized Bird was the only person who understood the pressure of saving the league. The racial tensions erupted publicly after the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals. The Detroit Pistons lost Game 7 to Boston, with Bird making a legendary steal of Isaiah Thomas's inbound pass in Game 5 that shifted the series. In the emotional locker room afterward, Dennis Rodman declared, "He's not God. He ain't the best player in the NBA, not to me. He's white. That's the reason he gets the MVP award." When reporters asked Isaiah Thomas to comment, he seemingly agreed. Larry Bird is a very good basketball player, but if he was black, he'd be just another good guy. The comments triggered a firestorm, but the underlying frustration was more nuanced. Bird had won 3 consecutive MVP awards from 1984 to 1986. In their eyes, a predominantly white media voting bloc was elevating Bird beyond his peers partly because of his race. The statement that Bird would be just another good guy if he were black was statistically hyperbolic. Bird's numbers were extraordinary regardless of race, but it spoke to a subjective truth felt in locker rooms, that the threshold for praise was lower for white players, and the ceiling for adulation was higher. The voting patterns for MVP awards during this era reflected a complex reality. While Bird's statistics justified his 3 consecutive MVPs from 1984 to 1986, the perception among black players was that similar statistical dominance by black players might not have generated the same narrative reverence. They saw how Bird's 24 points, 10 rebounds, and 6 assists were framed as complete basketball, while similar stat lines from black players were sometimes dismissed as expected production from superior athletes. The resentment wasn't about denying Bird's talent. Most players privately acknowledged his brilliance. It was about the comparative weight of recognition. When Magic Johnson averaged a near triple-double in the 1982 finals and won MVP, the narrative emphasized his team's depth. When Bird dominated the 1984 finals with similar numbers, the narrative emphasized his individual genius overcoming limitations. This asymmetry in storytelling created a perception that white excellence was amplified, while black excellence was contextualized or diminished. The frustration wasn't with Bird personally earning accolades, but with the sense that the system gave him a multiplier effect that black players had to work twice as hard to achieve. Rodman later admitted his comments came from immaturity and the shock of losing to someone who didn't look like an elite athlete. "I was so young and stupid," he reflected years later. The visual dissonance of Bird dominating the hyper-athletic Pistons was genuinely confusing. To be beaten by someone who appeared unathletic was difficult to accept without attributing it to external bias. Isaiah Thomas later attempted to clarify, arguing he was employing satire to highlight the double standard. He claimed he was mimicking how white observers spoke about black players. "I was trying to make a point about the stereotypes," Thomas explained, but it got lost in the translation. Despite the clarifications, the incident cemented the narrative that the bad boy Pistons hated Bird not just as a rival, but as a white icon. If the media narrative provided the socio-political fuel for the tension, Larry Bird's on-court behavior provided the spark. Black players expected white players to be quieter, more deferential. Bird shattered this expectation with trash talk viewed as deeply disrespectful. Dominique Wilkins experienced this shock as a rookie in 1983. Before a game, Wilkins went to shake Bird's hand, a standard gesture of respect for a veteran. Bird refused, keeping his hands behind his back. "You don't belong in this league, Holmes," Bird told him. Bird then told Wilkins exactly how he would score, asserting, "I don't know why they got you guarding me, Holmes. You can't guard me." Bird scored 39 points. The use of Holmes, slang derived from homeboy, was a linguistic appropriation that disarmed Wilkins. It was a power move that established Bird as the alpha, using language typically associated with black street culture. It bred a hatred born of humiliation. Wilkins later noted that Bird broke his confidence, something few players could do. Bird was not just beating them, he was dismissing their right to share the court with him. What made Bird's trash talk particularly devastating was its specificity and follow-through. He didn't engage in generic insults or empty boasts. He told opponents exactly what he was going to do, then did it. Against Xavier McDaniel, Bird reportedly said before a crucial possession, "I'm going to get the ball right here, I'm going to shoot it right in your face, and there's nothing you can do about it." Then he caught the inbound pass at the exact spot he indicated, shot over McDaniel's outstretched hand, and made it. This wasn't just psychological warfare, it was prophetic humiliation. The predictive element made it worse because opponents knew what was coming, but still couldn't stop it. The trash talk also exposed the paradox of Bird's public persona versus his on-court behavior. Media portrayed Bird as the humble small-town kid, the blue-collar worker, the quiet professional, but on the court he was perhaps the most arrogant player of his generation. This disconnect between public image and private reality frustrated black players who felt their own confidence was often portrayed as cockiness or arrogance. When Bird told opponents they were beneath him, it was called competitive fire. When black players showed similar confidence, it was sometimes framed as showboating or lack of respect for the game. This double standard and how aggressive confidence was interpreted along racial lines added another layer to the resentment. One of Bird's most psychologically damaging tactics was expressing offense when opposing teams put a white player on him. Isaiah Thomas recounted hearing Bird scream at the opposing bench, "Don't ever put a white guy on me. I feel disrespected when you put a white guy on me." This tactic was multi-layered and particularly infuriating for black opponents. By saying this, Bird was essentially agreeing with the black players that white players were generally inferior defensively. He was positioning himself as transcending his own race, while simultaneously using his race to insult the opponent's coaching strategy. Players like Ben Paquette or Mark Allery were often viewed by Bird as disrespectful matchups. He would tell the opposing coach, "Get this guy off me," implying that only a top-tier defender, usually black, was worthy of his attention. For black players, hearing a white star dismiss other white players was confusing and infuriating. It disrupted the yes versus them racial narrative they might have used to motivate themselves. It forced them to view Bird not as a great white hope, but as a ruthless competitor who devoured everyone, regardless of color. This particular aspect of Bird's psychology revealed something profound about how he navigated the racial dynamics of the league. Bird seemed acutely aware that he was playing in a predominantly black space, and rather than apologizing for it or being deferential about it, he used it as a weapon. By expressing offense at white defenders, he was simultaneously acknowledging the racial hierarchy of athletic ability while claiming to stand above it. It was a form of racial judo, using the existing tensions to his advantage. He was essentially saying, I know you think white players can't compete at this level, and you're right about everyone except me. The tactic also put opposing coaches in an impossible position. If they kept a white defender on Bird and he dominated, it confirmed Bird's point about disrespect. If they switched to a black defender, they were essentially admitting that Bird had gotten into their heads. Either way, Bird won the psychological battle before the physical one even began. This level of mental manipulation went far beyond typical trash talk. It was strategic psychological warfare designed to create self-doubt and frustration in opponents before they even attempted to guard him. What made this particularly galling for black players was that Bird was weaponizing their own lived experience of racial dynamics. They knew that white players generally were at a disadvantage at the highest levels of the game, not due to genetic inferiority, but due to the smaller pool of white players who made it to the NBA and the cultural factors that shaped who excelled at basketball. Bird was taking this uncomfortable truth and using it as a cudgel. He was forcing them to confront the reality that while their general observation about white players might have statistical validity, he was the exception that proved the rule, and he made sure they knew he knew it. The arrogance reached its peak on February 14th, 1986, against the Portland Trail Blazers. Bird announced he would play primarily with his left hand to save his right hand for the Lakers, whom Boston was playing next. Bird scored 47 points, with 20 coming from his left hand, and hit the game winner. For the Blazers and the Lakers, this was ultimate disrespect. Byron Scott later called Bird the biggest trash talker in NBA history, noting that this behavior made opponents want to kill him on the court. Julius Erving, known as Dr. J, was the elder statesman of the league and the epitome of class. On November 9, 1984, the Celtics played the Philadelphia 76ers. Bird was having an MVP-caliber performance. Erving was having an off night. Bird began to taunt Erving with the score, running down the court repeating 42-6. Bird had 42 points. Erving had 6. This violated the unwritten rules of the NBA brotherhood. You do not humiliate a legend, especially one who paved the way for the modern game. Charles Barkley recalls Bird calling Erving old man and telling him he needed to retire. The verbal humiliation became too much. A scuffle broke out. Barkley grabbed Bird from behind, and Erving delivered several punches to Bird's face. Both players were ejected. This fight was symbolic. The old guard of black excellence physically striking back against the new guard of white arrogance. The image of Dr. J, usually the coolest man in sports, losing his temper highlighted how deeply Bird's trash talk could cut. It wasn't just about points. It was about Bird's lack of reverence for the established pecking order. Bird cared about domination, not history. Bird was pissed off, and I'm not exactly sure why, Erving later reflected. Michael Jordan entered the league in 1984 just as Bird was at his peak. Jordan's relationship with Bird was different. It was the cold, calculating assessment of a predator looking at the current apex predator. It was less about race and more about territorial dominance, though the racial undertones of the Great White Hope still permeated the atmosphere. During a warm-up for an exhibition game between NBA stars and the 1984 Olympic team, which Jordan was on, a ball bounced over to the pro side. Jordan, the college kid, went to retrieve it. Bird picked up the ball. Instead of handing it to Jordan, he sneered and kicked it back over Jordan's head. Former Sports Illustrated writer Curry Kirkpatrick interpreted this gesture as Bird signaling to Jordan, "You're not only not getting this ball, I don't give a damn who you are." Jordan later said, "Bird was showing me it was all business now, and I was beneath him. I didn't forget." This moment defined their relationship. Bird refused to welcome Jordan into the fraternity. He treated him with disdain. This fueled Jordan's drive to eventually dethrone the Celtics. In the early years of Jordan's career, where he scored 63 points in a playoff game against the Celtics, only to lose. Bird famously called him God disguised as Michael Jordan after that game, a compliment that was also a dismissal. Bird still won. Jordan resented that he could be individually brilliant, but still lose to Bird's team cohesion. It reinforced the narrative Jordan spent his career trying to break, that a scoring champion couldn't win titles. rivals. The dynamic between Bird and Jordan represented a generational shift in the league's power structure, but it was complicated by the racial narratives that still surrounded Bird. Jordan was entering a league where Bird was the face of the NBA, the reigning MVP, the player who had helped save basketball from irrelevance. But Jordan also knew that part of Bird's appeal to mainstream America was his whiteness. This created a complex emotional response: respect for Bird's game, resentment of the system that elevated Bird, and determination to prove that the next era would belong to him. Jordan's competitive hatred for Bird was perhaps purer than that of earlier players, because Jordan entered the league with supreme confidence in his own abilities. He didn't doubt his superiority the way some older players might have. He simply saw Bird as the obstacle standing between him and his destiny. But even for Jordan, the racial element was inescapable. When people said Bird was making the game popular again, the subtext was clear. He was making it popular with white audiences who had drifted away. Jordan's mission became not just to beat Bird, but to become so transcendently great that his blackness became irrelevant to his marketability and universal appeal. The 63-point game in 1986 became a defining moment in this narrative. Jordan had done everything humanly possible. He had been superhuman, in fact, and yet the Celtics won, and Bird got to play the role of the generous king bestowing a compliment on the talented young prince. The "God disguised as Michael Jordan" quote was genuine admiration, but it also reinforced the hierarchy. Bird was still on top, still in control of the narrative. For Jordan, this was unacceptable. The loss planted a seed that would drive him for the rest of his career. He would later systematically dismantle the Celtics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and part of that mission felt personal, a response to that kicked ball, to that condescending compliment, to the entire experience of being treated as beneath Bird when Jordan knew he was destined for greatness. Why was this tension described as secret? In the 1980s, the NBA was marketing itself as family-friendly to overcome its drug-plagued image. Players were encouraged to be professional. The racial depth of the animosity was often kept within locker rooms rather than the mainstream press. The secret was the acknowledgement among black players that Bird was a symbol of a society that still hesitated to fully embrace black greatness. The concept of the hatred being secret requires deeper examination because it reveals the complex social dynamics of professional sports in the 1980s. The NBA was in a delicate position. The league had nearly collapsed in the late 1970s due to a combination of factors: drug scandals that tarnished the image of several star players, a perception that the game was too black for mainstream America, declining television ratings, and financial instability. The arrival of Magic and Bird in 1979 was viewed as a godsend, a chance to rebuild the league's image and financial foundation. In this context, the league had a vested interest in promoting rivalry without exposing the racial tensions that made the rivalry so intense. The marketing narrative was carefully constructed. Magic represented style and flash, Bird represented substance and grit, and together they represented a beautiful contrast that saved basketball. Any suggestion that this contrast was rooted in racial tension rather than just playing style threatened to undermine the wholesome narrative the NBA was trying to sell to corporate sponsors and television networks. Black players understood this dynamic implicitly, speaking openly about feeling that Bird received preferential treatment because of his race, or that the media used coded racist language to describe their play, risked several negative outcomes. First, it could be portrayed as sour grapes or excuse-making for losing. Second, it could be spun as the player being difficult or not a team player, which could affect contract negotiations and endorsement opportunities. Third, it could contribute to the perception that black players were angry or militant, stereotypes that already existed in American society. So the hatred was expressed in coded ways. It came out in locker room conversations that weren't recorded. It was discussed in black barbershops and at family gatherings, but not in mainstream press conferences. It was sometimes hinted at in the black press. Publications like Jet Magazine or the Indianapolis Recorder would occasionally acknowledge the racial dynamics more directly than white mainstream sports journalists. But for the most part, players maintained a public stance of pure competitive respect, while privately seething about the racial implications of how they were covered versus how Bird was covered. The 1987 Isaiah Thomas and Dennis Rodman incident represented a rare breach of this unspoken agreement. The emotions of a devastating playoff loss combined with the youth and relative inexperience of Rodman led to the public expression of sentiments that many players felt but rarely vocalized. The swift and severe backlash Thomas and Rodman received served as a reminder to other players about why these feelings were typically kept secret The consequences of speaking the uncomfortable truth about race in the NBA were professionally risky, but here's the remarkable transformation. In almost every case, this intense competitive animosity became genuine respect. Magic Johnson now calls Bird his brother and credits him for pushing him to become better. Johnson realized that without Bird, he wouldn't have become the player he was. "Larry, you're just what a basketball player should be," Johnson later said, choking back tears. Isaiah Thomas has spent decades clarifying his 1987 comments and praising Bird's genius. He acknowledges that his words were taken out of context, but also accepts responsibility for how they sounded. Dennis Rodman admitted his comments were young and stupid, and now acknowledges Bird's greatness without reservation. Dominique Wilkins tells the Holmes story with a smile now, acknowledging that Bird backed up every word of his trash talk. Even Julius Erving, who literally fought Bird on the court, came to respect the competitive fire that drove Bird's antagonism. The transformation reveals something profound about competition and respect. The hatred these legends felt was never simple animosity. It was the hatred born of being forced to evolve, to confront limitations, to acknowledge that greatness comes in unexpected packages. Bird forced them to respect him, not as a great white hope, but as perhaps the most complete player of that era. His trash talk, initially seen as disrespectful appropriation, was eventually recognized as the universal language of competitive excellence. This evolution from hatred to love is one of the most compelling aspects of the entire story. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual process that unfolded over years and decades. Several factors contributed to the shift. First, retirement provided distance and perspective. When players were no longer competing directly against Bird, when championships were no longer on the line, they could evaluate his career more objectively. They could acknowledge that while the media treatment of Bird versus themselves may have been racially biased, Bird's actual game was legitimately brilliant. Second, the personal relationship between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird served as a bridge for other players. When Magic and Bird's friendship became public knowledge, particularly through their emotional collaboration on an HBO documentary, it gave other players permission to reassess their own feelings about Bird. If Magic, who had suffered some of his most painful defeats at Bird's hands, who had been labeled Tragic Johnson after losing to the Celtics, could come to love and respect Bird, then perhaps the hatred others felt was more about context than about Bird himself. Third, time revealed that Bird had been fighting his own battles with respect and recognition. While black players resented that Bird received preferential treatment from media and fans, Bird resented being reduced to a racial symbol. He didn't want to be the great white hope. He wanted to be recognized purely for his basketball excellence. In interviews after his retirement, Bird expressed frustration with the racial framing of his career. This revelation helped black players understand that Bird was also somewhat trapped by the racial narratives of the era, even if he benefited from them in some ways. Fourth, as the NBA evolved and new generations of players emerged, the specific racial dynamics of the 1980s began to feel like historical artifacts. The league became more globally diverse, with international players becoming stars. Marketing strategies evolved. The crude racial stereotyping that characterized 1980s sports journalism became less acceptable. In this new context, looking back at the Bird era, players could see him as a product of his time, rather than as a personal antagonist. The friendship between Magic and Bird became particularly important in reshaping the narrative. Their relationship evolved from genuine hatred to professional respect to deep personal affection. When Magic was diagnosed with HIV in 1991, Bird was one of the first people to reach out to him with unconditional support. This moment of human connection transcended all the competitive animosity and racial tension. It revealed that beneath the rivalry was a shared experience. Two men who had carried the weight of an entire league on their shoulders, who understood pressures that few others could comprehend. Their joint appearances in later years, including emotional Hall of Fame speeches and documentary interviews, showed a warmth and mutual admiration that seemed impossible during their playing days. Magic would talk about how Bird made him a better player, how he pushed him to study film more carefully, to work on weaknesses in his game, to never be satisfied with good enough. Bird would talk about how Magic's creativity and joy for the game inspired him, how competing against Magic gave his career meaning and purpose. This public display of affection and respect gave other players a framework for reassessing their own relationships with Bird. Isaiah Thomas, who had suffered through the 1987 controversy, found opportunities to publicly praise Bird's genius in later years. He would break down Bird's game on television broadcasts, marveling at his basketball IQ, his shooting mechanics, his competitive instinct. The praise felt genuine because it was Thomas could now separate his frustration with the racial narratives from his assessment of Bird's actual skills. Bird's ability to generate this level of animosity was paradoxically the ultimate testament to his greatness. He didn't just beat these legends on the court, he got under their skin, challenged their identity, and forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about competition and excellence. The green ceiling, the perceived barrier to recognition that black players felt existed because of Bird's media treatment, was eventually shattered not by the players hating Bird, but by the players realizing that Bird, in his own way, was fighting the same battle for respect. Bird reportedly hated being called the Great White Hope. He didn't seek to be a racial symbol. He wanted to be recognized purely as a great player. The irony is that the black legends who initially resented him eventually gave him exactly what he wanted: recognition of his greatness that transcended race. They acknowledged that Bird was not great for a white player, he was simply great, period. The story of Larry Bird and the black legends of the 1980s is ultimately a story about context mattering immensely in the moment, but mattering less as time provides perspective. In the heat of competition, with racial tensions running high and media narratives feeling oppressive, Bird represented everything frustrating about American society. But with distance, these same players could see Bird more clearly as a ruthless competitor, a basketball genius, and eventually a friend. The secret hate was real. The racial dynamics were real. The media bias was real. But so was Bird's greatness. And so, ultimately, was the respect. The transformation from hatred to brotherhood didn't erase the legitimate grievances these players had about how they were portrayed versus how Bird was portrayed. It didn't invalidate their frustration with being called athletic, while Bird was called smart. Instead, it showed that people are complex enough to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that systemic bias existed, that Bird benefited from it in some ways, and that Bird was also genuinely one of the greatest players to ever touch a basketball. The legacy is complicated, as all honest examinations of race and competition must be, but the ultimate lesson is that the fiercest rivalries, rooted in the deepest tensions, can produce the most profound respect if the competitors are willing to see each other fully beyond the symbols they're forced to represent. Looking at this history through a contemporary lens reveals how much has changed and how much remains the same. The NBA today is far more diverse in every sense, racially, internationally, culturally. The crude racial stereotyping that characterized 1980s sports journalism is less common, though subtle forms of bias still exist. International players have complicated the simple black-white racial binary that dominated discussions in the Bird era. The league's marketing has become more sophisticated, less dependent on racial narratives to sell the game. Yet some patterns persist. Discussions about basketball IQ versus athletic ability still carry racial undertones in some contexts. European players are sometimes described using language similar to what was used for Bird: smart, high IQ, fundamentally sound, while American black players still sometimes face the athletic but not cerebral stereotype. The specific dynamics have shifted, but the underlying tendency to racialize discussions of playing style hasn't completely disappeared. What the Bird era teaches us is that these dynamics are negotiable, that individuals can transcend them through excellence and mutual respect, but that systemic patterns require active resistance. Bird couldn't single-handedly change how white journalists covered basketball, but he could refuse to embrace the Great White Hope label. Black players couldn't control media narratives, but they could eventually choose to publicly acknowledge Bird's greatness in ways that complicated those narratives. Progress came through countless individual choices to see beyond racial categories while still acknowledging their impact. The story also reminds us that history is never as simple as we remember it. The popular narrative of the 1980s NBA focuses on the beautiful rivalry between Magic and Bird that saved the league. That narrative is true, but it's incomplete. Beneath that surface story was profound racial tension, legitimate grievances, psychological warfare, and genuine hatred that eventually transformed into equally genuine love and respect. Both versions of the story are real. The sanitized version that celebrates the rivalry without acknowledging the racial complexity does a disservice to everyone involved. It erases the real struggles these men faced and the real growth they achieved. Understanding this complete history makes the eventual reconciliation more meaningful, not less. When we know that Magic Johnson genuinely hated Larry Bird, that Isaiah Thomas felt Bird was overrated because of his race, that Dennis Rodman believed Bird's MVPs were products of racial bias, the fact that these same men later came to deeply respect and even love Bird becomes more remarkable. It wasn't inevitable or automatic. It required time, perspective, emotional maturity, and a willingness to reassess initial judgments. It required Bird to demonstrate his greatness consistently enough that even those who resented the system that elevated him had to acknowledge his excellence. The transformation also required black players to separate their legitimate grievances about media coverage from their assessment of Bird's skills. This was not easy. It would have been emotionally simpler to maintain that Bird was simply a product of racial hype, that his success was unearned. But intellectual honesty and respect for the game demanded acknowledging that Bird was legitimately brilliant. He wasn't just good for a white player, he was one of the greatest players of any race. Making that acknowledgement while still insisting that the media coverage was racially biased required holding two truths simultaneously, which is always difficult but necessary for real understanding. For Bird's part, the transformation required him to understand the frustration black players felt, even if he didn't create the system that privileged him. Later in his career, and especially after retirement, Bird became more vocal about his discomfort with being used as a racial symbol. He acknowledged that being white in the NBA came with both advantages and burdens. He recognized that while he benefited from some media bias, he also faced the pressure of representing an entire race, of being expected to validate white fans' belief that white players could still dominate. This acknowledgement helped black players see Bird as more than just a symbol, as a human being who was also navigating complex racial dynamics. The final lesson of this story is that greatness and respect are ultimately earned through sustained excellence, not through media narratives or racial identity. Bird earned respect by backing up his trash talk, by performing in the biggest moments, by making his teammates better, by winning championships. The media coverage may have given him advantages, but it couldn't make him great. Only his work ethic, basketball IQ, competitive fire, and skill could do that. Similarly, black players earned respect by continuing to dominate the league, by proving their excellence was not accidental but intentional, by building Hall of Fame careers that spoke for themselves. In the end, basketball excellence transcended racial categories, even as it could never fully escape them. Bird was great, Magic was great, Jordan was great, Dr. J was great. Their greatness existed independent of media narratives, even as those narratives shaped how that greatness was perceived and celebrated. The hatred gave way to respect because excellence demands acknowledgement. You can resent the system, you can hate the racial dynamics, you can be furious about media bias, but when someone consistently performs at the highest level, when they dominate the best competition in the world, when they prove themselves in every conceivable context, respect becomes inevitable. The beauty of the transformation from hatred to love in the Bird story is that it shows respect earned through excellence can overcome even the deepest racial resentments. Not easily, not quickly, but eventually, authentically and meaningfully.